Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Roll Tootsie Pop? I don't know if you remember that commercial. Just a nice little lead in here to the Networking RX podcast. I'm your host, Frank Agin, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections. I raised that question, that the answer to that question was always the world may never know. They had the wise owl trying to figure that out. I raised that question because I was handed a research paper done by Jeffrey A. Hall of the University of Kansas, and the title of his paper, which was in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, was "How many hours does it take to make a friend?" And he starts out in his abstract, he says, the question of this investigation is, how many hours does it take to make a new friend? And this kind of builds on what we've talked about the last two episodes, Dunbar's number and applying Dunbar's number. He directly references it in the study, and it's very insightful. This is really complicated in the sense that his study builds on the work of no less than 15 other people. In other words, 15 other people who are putting together little aspects of friendship in our relationships to try and build on and present the opportunity for Hall to ask the question and do the research, how many hours does it take to make a new friend? And he indicates in his paper, it's not possible to have friends without first making friends. And some of those, that's a kind of a duh sort of a comment, but if you really stop and think about it, it's important. He talks about Dunbar's number again, and he essentially says that Dunbar proposed an evolutionary model of human relationships, and that the size of the groups we participate in are limited by the volume of our neocortex. The larger the neocortex, the volume of the neocortex relative to the remaining volume of the brain. So an elephant might have a larger neocortex than a human, but based on the relative volume of the neocortex versus the rest of the brain, humans have a much larger neocortex relative to the total size of the brain. And that's something a point I didn't make in the last two episodes I think is important. But he also then talks about some of Dunbar's work, and Dunbar puts friends in 5 separate categories, and in order of decreasing order. There's supporting cliques, and cliques in a clinical word or technical term for cliques, not the high school clique that everyone loathed. But the supporting clique is 1 to 5 individuals, which could include romantic partners and family, as you determine here, kin. But it also could include non-kin best friends. And we all know people, and maybe you, who have individuals who are not romantic partners, who are not family, which are really close friends. They're like family, and you see that from time to time. So that's the first group. The second group is the sympathetic group, which is generally 3 times larger than the supporting clique, 10 to 15 people, and includes several good friends. And then the groups that follow are friendship groups, and then what they'll term clansmen. That's what Dunbar terms, and those are respectively 40 to 50 friends. And then there's the clansmen, which are the rest of the tribe, 120 to 150. Now, obviously, if you are kin, you're part of that tribe. So the numbers are kind of cumulative. If you're a sympathetic in the sympathetic group, you're also part of the clansman group. So you're not getting numbers larger than 150. And again, this is all very theoretical, and you might say, well, what does any of this matter? And you know what? Maybe it doesn't, but it's always of interest. It's certainly of interest to me to think about as we start to make connections out there and build and create networks in this professional with our professional relationships. Um, and then the fifth category that Dunbar talks about is acquaintances. And acquaintances are the ones that get us by 150. Acquaintances might be, those 2,500 people that you're connected to on LinkedIn that you sort of know but don't really know. Those are acquaintances, and those probably come in all sorts of shapes and sizes as well. So it's possible to be part of those connections and not be, certainly not be a supporting clique or sympathetic group or Klansman. But some of the other research that Hall touches on is that, and and again, it's amazing all the stuff that's here, and I could probably devote a whole podcast just digging into all the articles that are cited here. But drawing on some of the research, what they've concluded is that it's possible to know somebody for years, but not develop a friendship, and that's entirely true if you stop and think about it. But then it's also possible to know someone for 6 weeks and become best friends. And that's entirely possible as well. I know people that I went to college with. I've known them for years. I know my neighbors for years, and we're not necessarily friends. Friendly, sure, but we're not friends. Know people through church. We're friendly, but not friends. But then when I went off to college, there were people that were there and knew them 6 weeks, less than a month, and were friends, and remained lifelong friends. So it's kind of interesting to think about these things, and essentially is that friendship is not necessarily a function of time. Friendship is more a function of activity during that time, if you stop and think about it. And they've actually looked at this. There was a study that Hall referenced that was back in 1965, where they confined two pairs of men who were strangers, and they essentially put them in a small room for 10 days, both morning and night. And the men were, they during the days they went off to work, but then during during the morning and the evening they were together. And then the control group were people that worked together. They weren't together morning and night, didn't share any kind of leisure activities together, but they worked together. And they made it so that the people ended up spending the same amounts of time together, the people who worked together and the people who lived together. And what they found was that the people who lived together, the people who spent morning and evening time together, which was more leisure activities, tended to become closer friends, sharing things that were closer than the people who worked together. People who worked together were just really kind of work friends, casual acquaintances. So again, it's very interesting when you stop and think about, friendship is not created via time. Certainly hours of time spent together matter, but what they're finding, what Hall is finding, and he's reporting with all these other studies, is it's not so much the time, but what's engaged in during that time. So you can work with somebody for 12 hours a day or 10 hours a day, let's be realistic, 10 hours a day, and you can spend 10 hours a day functioning with someone non-work related. It's casual in nature. And the casual activity is going to tend to build better friendships over time. And when I say friendships, it's just stronger relationships. And I think what this study is, showing is it's important that we work together. It's important that we have working relationships with one another, but it's also important that we have these leisure times. Just going and having a cup of coffee with somebody and sharing our lives. Hey, did you see the game? Again, it gets back to small talk. and it gets back to the notion of heuristic processing. And for those who haven't heard me talk about heuristic processing and aren't familiar with the term, heuristic processing is a term that they use for functions within our brain that our brain has developed shortcuts for. And one of the shortcuts, for example, is when you engage in somebody in small talk, they're predisposed to trust you more than if you didn't engage in small talk with them. And our brain has this shortcut that says, okay, if I'm in a small talk conversation with somebody, I'm more likely to trust them. Or back to Hall's study, what he's finding is that the more intimate the relationship, the more types of things that are personal in nature that are shared, the more likely that the people become closer. And it's not necessarily a function of time, it's more a function of what's done in that time, what's shared in that time. And if you go home and you're just sharing work stuff, that's not going to develop the relationship as much as if you're just kind of sharing personal stuff, personal things with family. And it's likewise when you're dealing with people in your business circles. This is a podcast about professional relationships and business networking, but amongst the people in your professional circles, your business circles, to the extent you're sharing about things that are personal to you, and I'm not suggesting that you go overboard, but sharing little things about, hey, my son's t-ball team won, and getting them to share those sorts of things. Those types of activities are much more likely to solidify the relationship than the time you spent with your client just talking about brass tacks, talking about accounting, talking about tax, talking about ad specialty. So it just really underscores the point that we need to make a concerted effort to try and get the people in our networks talking about personal lives, developing relationships with them from that standpoint. I'm not suggesting that your clients need to be your close friends. That helps. It certainly helps. But you can't have all your clients be close friends. It's just not possible unless, it's not advisable. Let's just put it that way. It's not advisable. But if you want to develop better relationships with the people in your network, the way to do that is through getting into more intimate type things, talking about the personal type things, learning about them, learning about their lives. Are they married? Generally, where do they live? What kind of hobbies? What drives them? What kind of movies do they like? Do they see the game? Things like that. Those are the things that really kind of build acquaintances into friends, and then friends into closer friends, and then close friends into good friends, if you so like. Just kind of an interesting study, interesting stuff that Jeffrey Hall at Kansas University, University of Kansas, has put out. I just find these studies to be fascinating because they're not telling us something we probably can't figure out ourselves, but what they have done is they have really kind of put numbers to it, and for me at least, give me confidence when I talk about these sorts of things that there's science behind it. There's some science behind it, and it's not just somebody's conjecture that these things matter. They do matter, and there's research evidence to support that. The important point to Hall's work is that time together matters, but really it's the quality of that time together, not just the quantity of that time. If it's all business, you're going to run into problems. It needs to be things that are akin to things that are social in nature, sharing about one another. So as you work with your certainly friends, but clients, customers, acquaintances, vendors, have that be part of your interaction. Your referral partners, have that be part of your interaction, because that will help build the relationship that much quicker. Before we wrap up, I want to remind people that we are looking for people to add to our stable of franchisees. AmSpirit Business Connections has a wonderful franchise opportunity where our franchisees help entrepreneurs, sales reps, and professionals to become more successful through networking. I can kind of give you the details as to what it's all about, but I can tell you that it's a unique franchise opportunity in that it lends itself to be added on to what somebody's already doing. All of our franchisees do something else for a few hours in the morning, a couple mornings a week. Our franchisees are working with their franchise groups, helping them become more successful through networking. The rest of the time, they're designing websites, they're travel agents, they're merchant service professionals, financial advisors, realtors, SEO professionals, and the list goes on, coaches, consultants of various kinds. If you're interested, shoot me an email. We provide one at the end of the podcast here and also in the show notes.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connections. All rights reserved.